Welcome to the Level Design Podcast. In this episode, we talk to game design professor at Kent State University, author and games developer Pie for Breakfast, Christopher Totten. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to this episode of the Level Design Podcast. I'm Mark Drew, your usual host, and with me this episode we have Rob McLaughlin, lead designer at the Chinese Room.
Hello, it's good to be back.
Valentina Chrysostomou, game designer at Command Studio, along with myself, and Jonathan Wilson, level designer at Hangar 13. And a very special guest is joining us this week, which is Christopher Totten. Totten or Totten?
Totten.
Totten, okay.
Yeah.
I think every single level designer has your book. If they don't know you by name, at least everyone has an architectural approach to level design, right? Right? If you don't have it, stop, listen to the podcast, or if you can do it at the same time, go to Amazon or CRC Press or your home, anywhere that you get the biggest royalties from, and buy an architectural approach to level design. And whilst you're there, you can also pick up the Level Design Processes and Experiences book, which is edited by Christopher as well, which is very excellent. Welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here.
It's been a wish for me to have someone that's inspired me quite a lot through this book. My journey to be a level designer, if I can even call myself that, has included a lot of books, but I then realized I have two of your books, and I was like, oh, okay, but they're the same author, like the same author. I mean, once you edited, but these were like excellent guides, because there's a lot of, how can I explain it, books that are about game design, narrative, and animation and all these things, but not that many on level design. What got you writing that? What was it? Was it like, oh yeah, I have to write a book about architecture and level design?
First of all, hi everybody out in podcast land. So I have a master's degree in architecture. That's what I went to school for, and I started making games while I was in school because I was on my school swim team, and I had a buddy from computer science that we swam together, and he was like, hey, you use like 3D Studio Max and Photoshop to make all this artwork. I do coding. Let's start making video games together. Famous last words. And like, it is an
That's where it all starts, doesn't it?
And I'm like, I like video games. What could go wrong? But as an amateur effort, that didn't really turn into much except for like a bad Tetris clone. But I kind of got the bug of game development and started doing it, like little bits of it on the side. That was also around the time that a lot of books like Rules of Play and other things were coming out. So I really I started reading that type of game design book and realizing that they were discussing games the way that pieces of architecture were being discussed in my textbooks. So I started trying to like slip game design into my architecture projects a little bit, and it eventually became my thesis. So I had all of this background knowledge of analyzing game worlds like pieces of architecture and then vice versa. And that's how I started to build that stuff up. And then when I got out of grad school, that was during the recession, and nobody was really hiring architects because they weren't building anything. So I got a job teaching 3D at a game design school and was like, all right, well, let's start developing this. When I went to my first GDC, there were like people talking about architecture and level design as an area that they thought that should be explored. And I'm like, I can do that. That's me. Because again, I'd been doing some level design on some indie projects, a few of which I mentioned throughout the book. And, that's where some of those things come from are just things that I would do that seemed to work, seemed to make sense to me.
Because a lot of in architecture, by the way, and this is a fanboy here, because when I was about 17 or 18, deciding what to do at university, I wanted to do architecture. That was my thing. I studied for 2 years to do it. Didn't have enough math to get into architecture, and then computers came about, and I was like, oh, I could go and do it. But what I realized I liked doing was playing on the computers, not so much worrying about the buildings. but I could do 3D stuff, and ended up doing computer information systems. But to this day, I wanted to be an architect. I think it was mainly for the polo necks, because apparently all the architects in the 80s, or like early 90s, wore polo necks and stainless steel pens,
So it was more of the fashion statement you wanted to pursue, Mark, not necessarily the building of things.
Exactly, right.
It's all about the image with Mark.
Exactly.
Not having to go in and wear the tie every day, which I guess when you do game development, you don't have to either.
Yeah, exactly.
Very much so.
But I mean, in all seriousness, one thing that put me off, which is a thing that now I think I look back on it and go, like, well, I would have learned a lot of stuff that's very relevant, which you've done, which is actually the 7 years, I don't know how much is in the States, of having to learn a lot of these systems. I mean, the design patterns, for example, comes out of architecture, this whole idea of how people use a space, how people navigate a space, what I guess a space means to somebody, right?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because when I was in school, a lot of what I write about came from architectural theory and architectural history. And, there are a lot of, just as there is in game development schools, there are a lot of people that are like, why do I need to know that? I'm here, I'm going to go learn CAD so I can get a job and all this other stuff. And when you work in an architectural office, you do spend a lot of time doing basic AutoCAD or Revit work where you're kind of building according to very familiar formulas. So you don't always get to use some of those theories that are the things that come from, quote unquote, great buildings. So that's been one really nice thing about being a game developer, is that I can use those things in spaces because my spaces can be completely fantastical. Like I'm working on a game right now called Little Nemo and the Nightmare Fiends, which is based on this famous comic strip from 1905 that's in the public domain. And that comic is known for these like images of architecture in it. And I just get to nerd out. I get to like look at, here's, Gaudi's Sagrada Familia. I'm going to turn that into my tile set for my environment and then, make this surreal level, like just covered in ice, but it's also this famous church I like. So, that's the thing that I've really enjoyed, is that I feel like level designers get more freedom to use that stuff than everyday architects do. Obviously, we're still working within very different technical limitations, but fantasy
or actual
isn't
material,
one of them.
like cost of like getting like, how much would like 50,000 tons of rock to make your tower, right?
You mentioned not having enough math, and that was the funny part, because like I roomed with another friend of mine who was a structural engineer my junior year, and his dad was also a structural engineer, and he would come visit and say, I'd be doing like structures homework, and Mr. Czar would always say, they only teach you enough structures to make you dangerous. So, the joke among engineers is that we don't have enough math. And then I would design something and my roommate would be like, you can't do that. You know how much that costs? I'm like, there's no budget.
I think we get the same stuff though in game development. If you want to design a crazy level, someone has to make the environment art, has to maintain the makes it texture, someone has to like write the quest in there. So even if you want to design a level, there is a cost, but at least it won't crush you to death if you do something wrong.
Yeah,
so there's that.
I guess the instances of players being actually killed by people's levels are probably substantially smaller than the number of people who architects are killed.
One of the benefits of working in the context that I do on small indie teams or academic teams is that I can go to our programmer and be like, can I do this? They'd be like, yeah, sure, whatever.
How much of your background in architecture do you use at the university where you're a professor, right?
It's really funny because, so we have an environmental game design course, or at least that's what it's called, that has been classically taught by somebody else there because that was established before I came into the course. It's not a dedicated level design course. It's more like a blend of environment art and level design. So I try to put level design lessons in other courses I teach to supplement and make sure that the students are getting this material. And one of the things that, you ask, like, how often do I use it? It's actually like at the slightest provocation, I just can't help myself. I will almost start vomiting architectural theory. My poor students. When they're doing an environment for a game, it is very applicable, and it's easy to talk about, to say like, oh, well, have you thought about this? Have you thought about, building a sight line in this way? Or have you thought about looking at this building that does it? Or, changes in elevation and things like that. I mean, so much of what has become written about as good level design also is good architecture. That's the cool thing, is that a lot of what people are publishing now is like, oh yeah, that makes sense. That's what you do when you have a building.
It's a connection I also see with other types of, I don't know, I guess I studied education, for example, and that's about teaching people. And I saw so much of game design in that, and when I was doing my university course, because it's about, I don't know, how to do progression and flow and how to teach actual human beings. How do you get to this level? You have to have a few steps beforehand, and you have to figure out how are they gonna get there, and you actually go and do that and teach and try it out and see how it fails. And I feel that kind of helped me a lot as a game designer, even though it sounds unrelated, but I feel a lot of other fields in real life apply to game development, which I think we should use in universities too, but I haven't seen it as much. Like player psychology is just basically just normal psychology. So why are we not integrating some of that into, our classes?
Well, and it's interesting too that, if you look at the book and the books, it's architectural approach, but a lot of the architectural approach is taken, some of the books that have really inspired me that come from architecture are ones that pull really liberally from psychology and education. I cite this one, Origins of Architectural Pleasure, a lot. And I mean, it's all about human psychology and why the author contends like we originally liked spaces. Like what is it about certain spaces that makes humans react positively to them?
A sort of universal language of spaces, you mean?
Yeah, and that was one of the things that I did think that architecture really could apply to level design when I started getting into this, because if you read older game design books, they would, I'm not going to name the book, but there is a book with an intro that literally says, we will not write about level design because it is so specific to genre and game that you can't write about it. And I'm like, no, height is height.
Yeah.
But it's like,
I mean, even on a platformer, right? I mean, you don't have to talk about that. But if you're talking about affordances and, I did a design A-level, so like ergonomics and, anthropometrics, which also then fit into a greater scale into architecture. You can talk about level design in those terms, right?
Absolutely. And, because height is height, light and dark are light and dark. We react in certain ways to those, but then you can be like, all right, well, how am I going to use this in a first-person shooter? How am I going to use this in a horror game or a platformer, an adventure game, or something like that? But in terms of going and pulling from psychology, again, that's one of the things that I really like about the way that those architecture books are structured. And I think some of my favorite game design books work in the same way, where they're just kind of realizing that you can like pick and choose from different things. What I don't want to see is game design become too self-reliant too fast and to think that we've figured it all out. There are a few pieces of game design or game studies writing where people react to them kind of like, hey, we figured it out, everybody, congratulations.
But I don't think that's like something that's ever going to happen, right? No one's going to get the silver bullet where one thing solves all these design problems we have. And like in level design, that's always going to be one of the cases. The fascinating thing about it, like you said, we can use color lighting and shape and stuff as a fundamental rule set, but it's up to you as the designer to figure out how that applies to your space and the challenge you're trying to overcome. And that's why we get a lot of varied levels, and luckily not every game's the same. Even if it is the same genre or the same style, the game turns out differently because of how it's assembled.
Yeah, a friend of mine is working on a book. His name is Chris Barney, and he's writing a book called Pattern Languages for Games. And it's not that he is making a pattern language, like a Christopher Alexander style pattern language. It's that he's looking at Alexander's process for creating patterns and writing how you can create your own patterns. And like that's the really interesting part, is that adapting to your project. Because like if you really think about any conference talk on level design, it's always, we had problems in our game related to level design. Like we had to figure out how spaces in our game worked, so we did, and here's what we figured out. And that's just patterns, right? So shameless plug for my friend, look for that one. But that's kind of it though, right? Is that, you know, there are these truths, but you'd have to adapt them, because, you know, you're never going to design the same thing twice. That's why when I teach, I'm so against like recipes. You know, there's a few instances where you can, like, your first time through, be like, oh, make that. Okay, now you know where the buttons are. But after that, it's just like, look, you've seen this, just go. And if you're stuck, use the code reference.
Yeah, I think it's a case of like, you can have a predetermined list of rules of what's possible in the game, but outside of that, run with it, do what you want. Do, like, you use patterns as example for your friend's book. Like, you could establish a pattern in your level or a pattern for your game, but then another game could be the same, but it's got a different pattern, so it feels different. And it also has a different, like, group of ingredients, for instance, from mechanics, like how it's put together, but it's applying the same principles. But because you use different ingredients, in this essence, the kind of mechanics of it, the game turns out differently as well, which is one of the fascinating things about level design.
Yeah, how does one hire a game developer then if we have no rules? And how does our experience translate? Do we actually know those things?
Let me riff a bit on the subject of recipes, which I think is a really good analogy. Hiring someone, if they're a chef, who has the fundamentals of all the sauces and the ways to cook things and the rules of how to cook things and how meat is cooked, how vegetables are cooked and everything like that, then you can hire them as a chef. But then they can go on to create something that's truly unique and will bring people into your restaurant. And just like that, I think you should hire level designers who have an understanding of the basics, the kind of the basic sources that make up a good level design, and then show the ability to take that further, to sort of say, well, here's what I've done with these ingredients that everyone uses, and this is why it's different, and that's what keeps people excited, because people don't want to eat the same thing every day, and people don't want to play the same game every day. And that's why I really agree with what John said earlier. Luckily, people don't want to play the same game again and again and again, so it's good that we've got endless innovation there.
Even with like what Rob said there, it's like he's right. The reason we read all these books, we watch all these talks and things like that, is so we can, I guess, expand our fundamental knowledge. So like, you learn these techniques and basics. You don't necessarily need to know exactly how someone built that exact thing, because you don't want to go and recreate it, but you want to understand the rules that were applied, the techniques were applied, what's the lighting doing, and then you can take that and apply it to the next project you work on, the next genre. And I think the one thing that excites me, I like working on a variety of different things. So like, a lot of the things I've done throughout my career have been very different, from platformers to VR puzzle games to now like an action game or whatever in Mafia. Fundamentally very different games, but I've been able to take the design knowledge of how building stuff up and kind of reapply that knowledge using their ingredients for their projects to keep it more exciting.
So the latest thing that I've been thinking about and starting to write about is not just like the architectural processes, but how designers are supposed to be taught to think. And especially in architecture, I feel like game design struggles with the idea of precedent. Like, we do and we don't. You know, there's this call to be so original and to have ideas just come out of nowhere sometimes. But then there's also this other part of game design that's like, what if I made a game that was basically just a remix of all these Capcom games that I really liked from the NES era, right? And then you get Shovel Knight, and it's great. But there's this way that designers outside of game design are taught to work that I think is really important, which is look at a bunch of buildings. And in our case, it'd be like, watch those talks, play those games, see what examples you can get, and then really think about what it is you liked about those things, and then apply their lessons to what you're working on. And where I've used that in my own design knowledge. And one of my professors used to call this design thinking, which I realize is this like now commodified buzzword. And I really hate that because it's really a useful concept. But like I've called it design thinking in writing, and I'm just like, man, I really hope like if I ever get to the point where I have enough content for a book of this, I'm so screwed if I call it that, because people are gonna be like, Chris, what are you doing? But there is, like precedent study is super important, and part of my own design process is, okay, look at a thing that I want to make a game about, figure out what its themes or its verbs want, whether like I made that Don Quixote storytelling game. It's like, well, what is Don Quixote? What is that book about? What happens in that book, right? So see what actions are in that and themes are in that. Think of some game mechanics. Think of games that are like that, and then put them in a blender, make a prototype with some of the borrowed mechanics, and just put it in front of somebody and see how it plays. It won't work. But you'll start to pick out what are the best bits. And this goes into the like, how do you avoid the recipe? How do you adapt to your own situation? You can I have literally put in a thing verbatim that worked in some other game that theoretically it should work, and it won't work. And that's great, because then what you have to do is you have to bend it and adapt it to your situation. Then suddenly it becomes different and unique and yours. That's the important thing. It's okay to start from borrowed stuff. It's that, like you said, how do you gauge people? How do you see the experience of making something come through? And it really is like, okay, you made this, it didn't come from a recipe, or it might have started with a recipe, but
by the end it's not.
And Mark has his hand up.
We're talking a lot about food here, recipes and restaurants and chefs.
Are we all hungry?
Well, I was about to bring in the Great British Bake Off. Because it's kind of like the technical challenges on that show, where they're just like, make meringue, right? And there's just something about that where if you have the basics, you're gonna make meringue, and then if it's hot that day, you have to be like, oh, I know, because I have this experience that I have to prepare it this way because it's super hot.
That's so strange that you mentioned the Great British Bake Off, because that's one of the things that I always talk about when I talk about design, or like even just different game developers. I'm like, they give you 1 hour, they give you the exact same ingredients, they give you the same recipe, and each individual person does so many different, does a different thing. And then it's the same with games. You can have the same recipes and stuff, but in the end, it's gonna be different if different developers make it, right?
And that's architecture school. They would be like, here's your site, make a hotel, go. And then you get 20 different hotels.
There's a documentary by Kirby Ferguson called Everything is a Remix, and it kind of codifies what you guys are talking about. I mean, it's a great documentary, so go and watch it. What I'm saying now is just a small part of it, but it says that the basic elements of creativity are copy, transform, and combine, in which you take an idea, you transform it in some way, and you combine it maybe with another idea, and this is how you get all the elements of creativity. And I don't know if this is a hot topic anymore, but I saw it, resurfacing again, which is, especially in a more designing one, people going, what, you use references? You don't just paint something out of, this is more in design rather than level design, or, in art, and it's like, yeah, you that's how creativity has always worked. So I notice a lot of disparaging comments to games that say, oh, well, that was just a mechanic from this other game. You're going like, yeah, but just because you spotted a pattern, like they used a color, doesn't mean that they've just copied another game. They've transformed it. They've made it part of that experience.
They fully incorporated it into for their purposes in their game.
Right.
It's not like a copy paste job. It's used in the exact same way. It's used to leverage and kind of drive forward their ideas and help navigate the player in their circumstances.
Yeah, isn't there a quote like "great ideas are stolen" or something like that, right?
Yeah,
we'll have to have an episode all about Roland Barthes and the death of the author, and all the stuff I learned in my English degree. How everything is just a tissue of quotations. And we can say that all games are just a tissue of different mechanics.
But I'll give you a concrete example that's come up recently, which was the Ghost of Tsushima Tsushima. Sorry, I apologize. I just read it, so I didn't learn the pronunciation. Has got a way of guiding the player with the wind, right? And it's a really beautiful experience to experience that, because it's both present and also subliminal. So it's kind of pushing you in a certain direction. And I think everyone said, "Oh, well, that's just Breath of the Wild. That's just Breath of the Wild, right?" And you're like, well, no, it's not, because it's done in a different way. It evokes different feelings. It's implemented in a different way. So even though if you're talking about a very specific mechanic, it's the landing. Does it stick the landing? And how does it interact with other systems?
If you're not okay with those kinds of borrowing... Oh, man. Okay, so I'm about to get into some muddy water here.
We encourage this.
Yeah, but which isn't really that muddy water, because I think like we've established that games are an art form, right? Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We have. But this is what gets me about that discussion, is that people are like, we want to be an art form, but what they want is some sort of stamp and like a party, and they don't want to go through the like what it means to be an art form, which is like, if you have that wind mechanic, so what if it's borrowed from Breath of the Wild? All that does in the art world, if games are an art form, what that means is that increases Breath of the Wild's case for being like canonized, right? And being considered like an important piece of design. So it's not just is the game good? It's that, do we start, like, where does the game influence other games, and how do you start to see that appear in other works? And, you know, I did a talk about works in the public domain a few months ago at like a digital conference. And that was one of my main points, was public domain is cool because like once something enters the public domain, then people can start to utilize it, and then they transform how people engage with it. You know, you don't have to wait until an entire work is in the public domain. Game mechanics, unless they are so unique that they become patented, you know, have this lineage of how they're implemented.
And a lot of time, like patenting like something like that, like a game mechanic, actually goes against protecting the original creator's intention, because it's meant to give money for your invention, right? It's meant to be a way for you to be able to sell that invention outside of its original intended purpose, right? Now, in which game company are you going to go, right, okay, what we're going to do is going to see if we can license that idea, right? They'll go like, nah, we'll come up with something else. If that's patented, we'll do something else rather than do that. I remember there was a lot of videos a few years back, I think they got taken down, that was, can you imagine the amount of creativity that we now call fan fiction, but fun creativity if they made a whole bunch of other Star Wars films, right? So like, if that had gone into the public domain in time, I mean, it wouldn't be in the public domain for quite a few years, but Star Wars will never go into the public domain.
No, I mean, and that's one of the things that was so pleasurable about working with a novel like Don Quixote, is that it's this wonderful toy, this world and these characters that you can play with that, I mean, it's 400 plus years old, like nobody's coming after you, but you can then create something that adds commentary and meaning to that conversation. And that's why right afterward I was like, well, I love these comics from the early 20th century. Let's do something like that now. And, you know, now we can look at them critically and be like, all right, how does looking at this through the lens of like, well, this is kind of surreal, but this is before there was surrealism, and then surrealism happened. So what if we take like Rene Magritte and kind of mush them together and then see what comes out, right? We get to do that because it's available. It's pretty great.
Yeah, and what you said earlier about people resisting the consequences that come of considering games as an art form, I think that one of the mistaken things as well that people do is resist the kind of criticism that comes with a genuine art form, where games will be criticised through a lens of many, many different facets, not just, oh, this game is a bit like this game, or this game takes this from that game. It's about looking at it through feminist, post-colonial, whatever lenses of criticism, and saying this is how this game relates to society as it was at the time the game was made. and this is how it relates to cinema, this is how it relates to literature, and all the different things of music or whatever. And that is something that comes as an inevitable outcome of considering games as art, is that you will get that kind of criticism, and you should accept it and revel in it.
If you can inspire that kind of conversation, you did it. That's the thing people don't get, is you did it. They understand criticism. Again, if this is one thing that when I teach, I really try to tell my students, I'm like, look, you're into games, you want to get into games, great. Start consuming things that are not just games. Or anime. I'm not ragging on anime. Like, I like anime, but
right.
But
it's too close.
Yeah, like have a broad cultural landscape, because then you understand how these things are dealt with. And in terms of criticism, if you are looking only at games, well, how have games been criticized for so long in a sort of commodified 5.5 out of 10, oh, it's not worth your purchase. Well, nobody's saying if it doesn't have anything to do with feminist theory that you shouldn't buy it, unless it really is saying like, no, this is egregious and bad and socially awful. But that's different though. It gets tangled with that weird commodification, and it's like, no, that's not what this is.
I think at the same time, though, as games have started to be viewed as an art form, it also came at the same time as games started to mature as well with the content they were actually dealing with. And it's like, I guess more recently, like talking about games being viewed as an art form and being in the public light. You look at all the press The Last of Us 2 got because of the themes and stuff it deals with in its story. And obviously not going into spoilers or anything right now. It's like they wanted to tell the story. If that was a movie, they wouldn't have got anywhere near as much flack as what they did for the story they told. But because it's a game, it's pulled out and actually almost dragged through the mud for it.
I agree, but also disagree. I think some of those arguments actually are done in bad faith, because this has been happening since the beginning of games. I remember when Doom came out in the UK, we had a woman called Mary Whitehouse that was trying to censor everything. Like, games are the most horrible things in the world, that they damage people's brains. Guy in the States who was doing the same thing, and I think he popped up recently.
Jack Thompson
about violence. Yes, but the thing is, when you start seeing this argument again and again, you're going like, you do know we've had this discussion, right? And you're bringing it up, and I'm pretty sure you know that this discussion is a bad faith discussion about games, because they've been on an art. I remember playing Metal Gear Solid and sitting through 45 minutes of like telling me why the military-industrial complex is really bad. But even then, they were making very big statements. Sure, Doom wasn't making a massive statement about hell on earth, but people were making statements. I think artistry or wanting to make a statement, wanting to make art, making something beautiful, something perceived beautiful, is why I think a lot of people get into this.
And I think that's why it's also controversial. I mean, Jonathan mentioned that, the backlash that The Last of Us 2 had was very big, but I think a lot of it came from the female characters in it. And you can see the same exact backlash when, I don't know, Wonder Woman comes out, or I don't know, Captain Marvel comes out, and all of the dislikes are more than the likes, and people say they don't like that, but the actual movies and the art is just normal. It's fine. There's no difference than anything else. And we are going to get those loud people saying those terrible things. And I just think it's horrible, but you can just not... I think it's going to always exist. It's going to always exist, and you have to find a way to deal with it, I think. And the bigger the art form and the impact, the bigger is going to be the negativity behind it. So you just have to be able to say, yeah, I'm ready for whatever's going to come, basically.
Yeah, and I think you're completely right, Valentina. And I think that it has been the case throughout history. It's just that people have a much louder platform now. I mean, it's very, Edgar Allan Poe or people used to get the most insane letters about their work. Everyone did, and Dickens and Mark Twain. The ridiculous criticism they got from there was exactly the same as today, except, it's just a letter between two people. It's not someone posting publicly on some forum or anything like that.
Where they're anonymous, right? So if I had to write a letter to the editor, "Dear sirs, I have found your game egregious, and Mark Drew of, this address," like, it's very much different to like that empty text box asking you to submit whatever's crossing your mind right now.
Yeah, they used to call them green ink letters.
One of my favorite books is Confederacy of Dunces by John Kennedy O'Toole. And for listeners who don't know what it's about this character who imagine like the worst person on Reddit, but in the 1960s. But he's also a medievalist, and he has to go get a real job, and like comedy ensues, like slapstick ensues. It's a really funny book, but that book's context changes if he's not in the 1960s. If like he basically blogs, but he has like legal pads that he like writes stuff on and then stuffs under his bed. Well, if that was a computer interface, then the book is suddenly very different and very horrifying, because then he'd find people like him. But yeah, that stuff has always existed to the point where you could make recognizable literary jokes about it. It just, we've thought about that with games, where I think the flip side of me working with some of the properties that I've worked with in some of my games has been, don't F it up. Because like, if I'm doing a Don Quixote game, I better read literary criticism of Don Quixote so that I know that if such and such professor of Spanish lit at some college sees it, I don't get like a really scathing but informed, review or something like that. I've thought about that a lot, and especially with the thing we're working on now. Like, we are, the original source material, that comic that we're working with, is, it's racist. Like, it's from 1905 in the United States. It has certain values that, like, the artist was really amazing for his time in a lot of things, but not in that particular thing. And, we are like tweaking it to fix that, basically. And I'm just like, yeah, somebody's going to be like, why'd you change that character? And just be like, are you kidding me? Why do you think I changed that character?
Well, this is something that's happening now, which, I don't particularly agree with erasing all the past and covering it up. But for example, Lovecraft, H.P. Lovecraft is a classic example of someone that was a
terrible person.
A terrible, terrible person.
You can't apply the for his time argument there at all.
No, he was terrible for his time. And
yeah.
Yes.
It was egregious.
Even notorious racists thought H.P. Lovecraft was a bit intense.
Yeah.
Too much.
Chill out, mate.
Too far.
But what's nice about it is that we're able to separate the man from the product, and his biases show through in the work, but we can see them. But also another side, talking about using this stuff that's in the public domain, is that, like, for example, you can create something like Lovecraft Country, which is a new TV series that's coming out. That's kind of like owning it and turning it around and being able to combine it, recreate it, put it into a different perspective.
I think this is really, really key to what Chris was saying earlier about giving people the knowledge, the breadth of knowledge in architecture, in product design, in literature, in music, in everything, that to make them create well-rounded and products where they understand where things are coming from. And that's where, when Hideo Kojima does a war game, he creates a world where his eyes are wide open about the military-industrial complex, whereas debatably some other war games created by Western studios, the scales are not fallen from their eyes, and they do not understand the context in which their game is operating. And then when people say, do you realise that your game is perpetuating some kind of horrendous post-colonial injustice? They'll go, huh? Because they don't have that knowledge. And that's key, is like what Chris says. You must get your students to read around things and to have a breadth of knowledge.
One of the things that I'm really proud, my colleague Tim Fritz and I have started working on is we have on our books a class called Gaming and Culture. And that's basically what it is. It is going to be, think about how your games do blend with the world around them, for good or bad. Think about, these conversations and the potential destructiveness of them. One of the things that really was very exciting from this past semester, before, we went into coronavirus shutdown, one of the sessions that we had with my game prototyping class, the students started a discussion of like ethical game design and what does it mean to design something in such a way that you are, I guess, trying to be socially responsible. And that like, we spent a half hour on that. Like, it wasn't even the lesson, but I was like, that's the lesson. That's better than the lesson that I had today. But young designers want that. They want to talk about that stuff.
Yeah, they see what's happening on the streets of Portland and they go, I want what I'm doing to reflect that reality.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly living in interesting times, and games, I say like I'm an ancient man, but people that have lived through this will reflect that in the product that's going to come out in the next few years.
Yeah.
So one thing that I noticed before 9/11, the explosions of buildings and big cities destruction was one way, and after 9/11, people now saw how that happened. So the special effects there were completely different, and I'm touching that subject very lightly. But the same thing is going to be with pandemics. We've now seen a pandemic.
Yeah, we've actually seen the effects.
Right. And they're not as bad as we thought they are. It's not like, even if the speed was really big, we don't have like cars parked at odd angles that everything's overgrown and stuff like that, right? But we can see other things happening. Sorry to bring it down right at the end of the podcast, like we've seen a pandemic. But what I wanted to say was actually all the things that are happening with around the globe with the pandemic and everything else. You're right. All the designers are going to start wanting to put that into their work, especially young ones, which are much more active in activism.
Yeah, and it's going to be an influence. Like that's and again, that's how art works. Like we are an art form. That's how the art works, and we are going to have the discussions that one does in that kind of art form, and that's super positive.
Chris, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today. We should talk before the end of the show a little bit about the Mancha and the other game that you did, Little Nemo.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, we've covered it a little bit because you've got it from a 1905 comic. But what kind of game is it?
So, Little Nemo is going to be a lot like the Shantae games, where it's going to be a non-linear platformer with like different areas, but there will be a centralized hub that you keep coming back to. So in the case,
okay.
So for those listeners who are not familiar, Little Nemo in Slumberland is a comic by animator and comic artist Winsor McKay from 1905, and it's noteworthy because it set a lot of what we consider modern comics language and how like frame layouts and graphic design can be part of the language of comics. It used a heavy Art Nouveau style with like lots of architectural drafting. There are some where you can tell that the artist is really just showing off. That's what the gag isn't that good, but he's just flexing. So there's a lot of that, but he also went on to create an animated film, like several animated films. The most well-known one is called Gertie the Dinosaur, which was just this like dinosaur animal act.
Right, but isn't that like the first animated film?
Yeah, it's like one of the most important early animated films out there. That's in the public domain. It's this wonderful fantasy world, and we wanted to. It's always been something that I thought, like, man, there's technically an NES game about it that's based on that movie from the 80s, but like somebody should make a better one. Then I was like, wait, I can do that. I'm a game developer. So we're doing like hand animated characters using Blender's new like 2D tools, which are really great. But yeah, so the idea is that like your hub area is Nemo's house, and when you jump in your bed, you can go to sleep and then go to Slumberland and choose which part of Slumberland you go to, and then like those will be just a little mini non-linear platformer. I don't want to quite say Metroidvania. That implies like one big thing, but little like sections like that. So again, like a Shantae or a Monster World type game. We're pulling from, again, in terms of like what I was saying before, where you pull from a lot of different sources. We've got a little bit of this game for the NES called Little Samson in there, which is this sort of action-y, you have 4 different characters to use game, a little bit of like some Capcom stuff. So we're looking at making just a really nice, solid, fun platformer.
Awesome. You've also got another game coming out, which we talked about, which is La Mancha, but that's kind of slightly different. That's more of a card game, right?
It is a card game, so that's actually out right now.
Oh, it is out. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's fine. Yeah, it came out in September, and then every release stuff has just kind of slowed down because of pandemic. But so that's a storytelling card game think of a apples to apples Cards Against Humanity like, except instead of using, dirty jokes or random objects to answer prompt cards, you have cards with quotes from books of chivalry on them. And all the situations are things from Don Quixote. It's a good way to trick people into playing a role-playing game, because you basically have to role-play as Don Quixote and fight stuff, like windmills and everything. But that was a lot of fun because there was an element of level design to it. The way that the deck with the scenarios works is that it's situations from the book. So I had them just all randomly shuffled, but then you'd get like stuff way too early. And I was like, I need to start changing my difficulty curve and how you encounter certain things. I was like, wait, I'm level designing, but it's a deck of cards. So it was actually kind of like a fun little level design exercise in a super abstracted form.
This is like playing 4-dimensional chess with you. It's like, it's a deck of cards, but it's also level design, and I'm adjusting difficulty curves. Now I'm going to have to check it out.
I'm really excited about it. It turned out really well.
It looks gorgeous, and as I said, I'm going to have to play it. Chris, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. I think we've gone a lot more academic and in depth than we normally go, but I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me. This was awesome.
If people wanted to say some more stuff to you or get in contact, what's the best way that they can do that?
So my email is ctotten, Totten, at pfbstudios.com. That's pie for breakfast, PFB. So that's the easiest way to reach out to me via email. I'm also on Twitter at Totter, Totter 87. So definitely hit me up there. And if you're having trouble, #level design, I usually am floating around there. That's a really great community. I recommend everybody join it. It's awesome.
We loiter and throw stuff at them. Well, thank you very much. I'm Mark Drew, and if you want to get in contact with me, it's at Mark Drew on Twitter. But also, if you have any feedback on the show, go to @LevelDesignFM on Twitter. Valentina, if people want to get in contact with you.
Yeah, they can get in touch from Twitter too. It's at Valentina Chris. That's CHRYS.
Rob?
Hello, yes, I'm on Twitter too, at RM McLaughlin.
And finally, Jonathan.
As always, you can reach out to me on Twitter as well, at Omni/92.
And thank you very much. And good night.
Good night.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
The Level Design Podcast has been a Command Studio production. Our editor is Matthew Lever, and this episode has been produced by Bridie Rhodes.